Imagine a place meant to be safe, where abandoned children should have found comfort, food, and shelter. But instead of salvation, the walls of this so-called sanctuary held a darkness so deep that history itself tried to bury it. For decades, whispers surrounded the Sacred Heart Orphanage, a holy facade concealing an unholy truth. Between 1928 and 1931, 71 young girls disappeared from within its walls, never to be seen again. Families were silenced, records were altered, and the community was left with only rumors of rituals, corruption, and something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface. Tonight, we uncover the chilling secret of Sacred Heart Orphanage. The Sacred Heart Orphanage was built as a beacon of charity, standing proudly with its towering stone walls and Gothic windows, a structure that gave off an air of safety and holiness to anyone passing by. To the community, it was a gift from the church, a place where abandoned and orphaned children could find shelter, education, and a path to a better life under the guidance of nuns and priests. Parents who could not feed their daughters were told to entrust them here, believing the holy sisters would raise them with love and kindness. The white robes of the nuns and the daily tolling of the chapel bell gave an impression of purity that was almost unquestionable, as though the very hand of God rested over the place. But what stood in the light of day often masked what stirred in the shadows of night, and the orphanage's pristine image was perhaps its most effective disguise. The facade of holiness worked like a shield. At a time when religion commanded reverence, few dared to question the word of priests or the actions of nuns. Sacred Heart had backing from wealthy donors, local politicians, and even the police chief, all of whom were regular visitors at church gatherings. Whenever a mother came forward whispering that her daughter had disappeared from the orphanage, she was met with sermons about God's will or veiled threats about questioning holy institutions. The families were poor, many of them immigrants with little power, and so their cries were drowned beneath the powerful voice of the church. In a town where faith was stitched into every aspect of life, to doubt the orphanage was to doubt God himself, and this fear silenced many who suspected something was wrong. Inside, the rituals of daily life were carefully staged to convince visitors of the orphanage's holiness. When benefactors arrived, they saw rows of girls in clean uniforms, heads bowed in prayer, voices rising in hymns that echoed through the great hall. The sisters moved quietly and gracefully, their hands folded, their smiles serene. If a wealthy family or official stopped by unannounced, they were given tours of tidy dormitories, neat kitchens, and classrooms filled with the gentle sound of reading lessons. These performances were rehearsed well enough that no one thought to look deeper, no one thought to question why the numbers on paper never quite matched the number of girls seen singing in the choir. Behind locked doors, however, there were things the public never saw. The walls were thick, the corridors long, and there were wings of the building visitors were never allowed to enter. Children whispered of certain doors that never opened, of nights when footsteps echoed through the halls long after the bell had rung for curfew, and of girls being called away, never to return to their beds. These whispers were dismissed as childish fears, but those who lived inside knew the orphanage had shadows darker than the night itself. The sisters who looked gentle in front of outsiders could become cold and severe when the public eye was gone, and those who questioned or resisted were punished with silence, isolation, or worse. It was the appearance of holiness that made the institution untouchable. Priests preached from the pulpit that Sacred Heart was a sacred gift, a cornerstone of the community, and to question its work was sinful. Newspapers published glowing articles about the generosity of donors who funded the orphanage, showing photographs of smiling children in neat rows, carefully staged to radiate innocence. This reputation became armor, shielding it from scrutiny even as the number of vanishings grew. For every girl who disappeared, records were forged or explanations were whispered to families. Adoption papers misplaced, distant relatives claimed guardianship, the child ran away to seek work in the city. Each excuse was cloaked in enough religious authority that grieving parents could do nothing but bow their heads and accept what they were told. The deeper the facade was built, the more dangerous the truth became for those who might uncover it. Teachers in nearby schools began to notice that some girls listed as orphans never actually appeared in classrooms. Shopkeepers recalled faces they never saw again. Whispers spread that the orphanage was hiding something, but the holy image discouraged open suspicion. The few who dared to ask too many questions found themselves visited by priests warning against gossip or by police officers who threatened charges of slander. Fear mingled with faith, creating a silence that gave Sacred Heart full control over its secrets. Those who lived in the town grew accustomed to the sight of the towering orphanage, its steeple reaching into the sky like a finger pointing toward heaven. The ringing of its bells reminded everyone to pray, but to the girls inside, the sound was often a prelude to dread. Outsiders heard music. The orphans heard the tolling that marked another night of uncertainty. The building itself seemed to conspire in hiding the truth. The high walls were meant to keep the children safe, but instead, they became prison walls, sealing them off from the world outside. The barred windows let in light but offered no escape, and the chapel where hymns echoed with such purity also held secrets buried in silence beneath its altar. What made the orphanage so sinister was not just what happened within its walls, but how it managed to convince the world outside that it was holy. Faith was turned into a weapon, and piety became the perfect disguise. The townspeople believed they were supporting God's work, feeding the hungry and sheltering the lost, but in truth, they were feeding something far darker. Behind every donation and every prayer lay the unspoken cost of lives quietly erased, their stories buried under layers of sanctity and silence, leaving behind only questions that no one dared to ask. The disappearances at Sacred Heart Orphanage did not happen all at once, and perhaps that is what made them so difficult to see in the beginning. The first girl who vanished was barely spoken of outside the walls, her absence explained away with a story of sudden adoption. Records were altered, and the nuns gave a calm reassurance to anyone who inquired that she had been taken into a good home. No questions lingered in the air for long, because why would anyone doubt the words of those devoted to God? But then another child was gone, and another after her, each one explained with the same quiet authority. At first the pattern was hidden beneath the veil of pious explanations, but as months became years, the number grew too large to be coincidence. 71 girls in only 3 years, their names written in books that were quietly locked away, their faces slowly fading from the memories of those who once knew them. The pattern of vanishings followed an unsettling rhythm. It was never a large group at once, for that would have been too obvious. Instead, it was one here, two there, spread apart by weeks or months, just enough time for suspicion to dull before it was stirred again. The girls who disappeared were often described as quiet, docile, or especially beautiful, chosen with a deliberation that suggested someone inside was watching carefully, selecting with purpose. They would be seen in the dining hall, the dormitory, or the chapel one day, and by morning their beds were stripped, their belongings removed, and the staff insisted they had been placed elsewhere. For the younger children, it seemed as if the earth itself had swallowed their companions, leaving only the echo of a name whispered in the shadows of the corridors. Among the orphans themselves, the disappearances became a subject of fear and hushed speculation. They whispered to one another at night, lying awake and staring into the darkness, listening for the sound of soft footsteps that might stop outside their door. They began to notice the signs that one of their own was about to vanish. A nun taking particular interest in her, hushed conversations between staff, or being summoned to the upper floors where children were rarely allowed. Once taken there, the girl would never return. The survivors told of an unspoken rule that none dared to break: never draw attention to yourself, never question the sisters, never linger near the forbidden hallways where the chosen were led away. The townspeople, too, began to notice that children from the orphanage were rarely seen playing outside anymore. The laughter that once spilled out from its courtyard was replaced with eerie silence. When questioned, the staff explained that the girls were kept busy with prayer, sewing, and study, preparing them for lives of virtue and service. Any mention of missing children was dismissed with simple, practiced replies. She was adopted. She ran away. She found work in the city. Each explanation was delivered with such calm confidence that people accepted it, or at least pretended to, because to challenge the orphanage was to challenge the institution of faith itself. The local authorities recorded very few official investigations into the vanishings, a fact that itself painted a disturbing picture. Complaints filed by desperate families were quietly buried in drawers, never reaching the newspapers. When a mother demanded to see proof of her daughter's adoption, she was turned away with threats that her soul would be damned for questioning God's work. Poor and powerless, these families had no means of pressing further, and the police, often parishioners themselves, sided with the church. Some even suggested that the families should be grateful that their children had been given the chance for a better life, ignoring the gnawing truth that no one had ever actually seen these supposed new homes. What makes the timeline even more disturbing is the way it coincided with certain religious festivals and seasons of the year. The majority of the disappearances clustered around holy days, feast days, and periods of fasting, as if their vanishings were part of a ritual calendar. Each new absence came with the tolling of bells that marked the celebration of a saint or the solemn quiet of a holy week, and the coincidence grew too striking to ignore. To the orphans who remained, these days became ones of dread, their prayers whispered with trembling lips, each girl silently begging not to be chosen next. As the numbers grew, a quiet sense of horror spread through the town, though it was never spoken aloud. People began to keep their distance from the orphanage, crossing themselves when they passed its gates, avoiding the gaze of the looming statue of the Virgin Mary that stood watch in front of the chapel. Shopkeepers noticed that fewer children came into their stores with the nuns. Farmers who once donated food began to hesitate, their wives whispering of curses and bad omens. Yet no one confronted the sisters directly, for fear of divine retribution or social ruin. The orphanage's holy reputation acted like a stone wall, one that no ordinary citizen dared to scale. The disappearances also left their mark in subtler ways. Teachers noticed gaps in school rolls that could not be explained. Parishioners remembered faces that seemed to vanish from the front rows of Sunday Mass. Yet whenever anyone thought to ask, the answer was always the same. She has been placed. She has found her home. She is gone by the grace of God. The consistency of these replies, delivered with unwavering serenity, began to sound rehearsed, like lines from a play designed to mask something terrible. The pattern of vanishings did not just reflect negligence or coincidence, but design. Each disappearance was woven into the fabric of the orphanage's routines, as though part of a plan too carefully constructed to be chance. The choice of victims, the timing of their removal, and the way the records were manipulated all pointed to an operation carried out with precision. To those on the outside, it seemed like isolated cases, but those who dared to look at the whole picture began to see the horrifying truth. 71 children had gone missing in just 3 years, and not a single one had ever been seen again. Whispers began to swirl around the Sacred Heart Orphanage, faint at first, then louder as the vanishings grew harder to ignore. People in the town spoke cautiously, never above a murmur, for fear of offending the church, yet even their fear could not silence the unease. Some said the missing girls had been taken for strange rituals, others whispered about experiments carried out in hidden chambers, and a few claimed they had seen shadows moving behind boarded windows long after the building had gone dark for the night. The orphanage stood tall, proud in daylight, but when night came, it seemed to shift into something else entirely, its stone walls holding secrets that pressed down on the silence of the town like a suffocating weight. Among the children who lived inside, the rumors took on a sharper, more immediate shape. They spoke of nights when the nuns carried candles down the hall, their faces shrouded in hoods, leading chosen girls through doors that were always locked during the day. The younger children asked where their friends had gone, but the older ones learned quickly never to question. They said beneath the orphanage were cellars, deep and damp, where the sound of chanting rose up through the cracks in the floorboards. Some claimed they had heard crying mixed with the prayers, not the gentle weeping of children, but the sharp wails of fear. These stories spread quietly from bed to bed at night, whispered under thin blankets, each word making the shadows in the dormitory seem thicker, each sound in the hall a threat. The townspeople added to the rumors, building on what little they thought they knew. Farmers claimed they had seen strange lights glowing in the orphanage chapel after midnight, not the flicker of candles, but a steady, unnatural radiance. A butcher swore that once, while delivering meat, he had been taken through a side door and glimpsed drawings on the walls that looked nothing like scripture, but more like twisted symbols, shapes he had never seen before but which filled him with unease. A laundress whispered that the linens she washed carried stains that looked nothing like dirt, marks that smelled of copper and clung stubbornly to the cloth as if they had seeped deep into the fibers. Each rumor added another layer to the growing suspicion that the orphanage was not what it pretended to be. There were also stories of experiments, and these carried a cruelty that chilled those who repeated them. Some believed the priests and nuns were using the children as subjects for strange medical studies, injecting them with concoctions, drawing blood for reasons never explained. A boy who worked as an errand runner claimed he had once seen glass jars lined on a shelf in a locked room, filled with cloudy liquid and something floating inside. He could not say what it was, only that it was small, pale, and human-like. Though dismissed as childish imagination, his story spread, and others began to say they too had heard the clinking of glass, the scraping of metal, the muffled sobs of children forced into something beyond their understanding. The architecture of the orphanage itself seemed to support these tales. There were windows that opened into nothing, hallways that led to bricked walls, staircases that descended only to vanish into locked doors. Workers who had once been hired for repairs reported finding sealed chambers as though whole rooms had been deliberately hidden. One mason told of a passageway he was ordered to wall off, though he swore it smelled of earth and decay, as if it led down into the ground. No one ever saw him in town again after he spoke too freely of what he had found. These accounts deepened the sense that the orphanage was less a sanctuary and more a labyrinth designed for concealment. Even priests outside the order began to suspect something. One visiting clergyman left shaken after being barred from certain wings during a tour. He later confided to a friend that he had heard noises from the locked rooms, groaning, scraping, something that sounded like chains being dragged across the floor. Yet his words were never made public, for to accuse the orphanage was to risk being cast out of the church, and so he carried his suspicions silently until his death. The institution's power and the town's fear ensured that every voice that might have spoken against it was swallowed before it could rise too loud. What made the rumors endure was the consistency across different accounts. Children, workers, visitors, and townsfolk all described elements that overlapped: locked doors, strange lights, muffled cries, hidden chambers. Though none could prove their stories, together they formed a picture too coherent to ignore. It was as if the orphanage itself breathed these whispers into existence, each crack in its walls leaking secrets, each shadow hinting at the truth it contained. Over time, the legends of Sacred Heart grew, blending fact and fear until no one could say where one ended and the other began, yet everyone felt the chill they carried. Some families who lost daughters began to believe the worst, even if they dared not speak it aloud. They placed candles in their windows, prayed for souls they feared were already gone, and avoided walking past the orphanage after dark. Mothers clutched their remaining children tighter. Fathers warned their sons never to linger near its gates, and the once proud building became a place people crossed themselves to avoid, even as it continued to stand as a monument of supposed holiness. The silence of those within and the whispers of those without created a haunting contrast. The louder the rumors grew, the more fiercely the orphanage cloaked itself in piety. The truth behind the disappearances was buried beneath these whispers, hidden under layers of superstition, fear, and faith. Whether it was rituals cloaked in religious trappings, experiments disguised as charity, or something darker still, the rumors clung to the walls of Sacred Heart like shadows that would not lift, feeding the town's unease and sealing the orphanage's legacy as a place where innocence was consumed by secrets too terrible to name. The stories of Sacred Heart Orphanage might have remained only whispers, but there were a few who lived long enough to tell pieces of what they endured. Survivors were rare, and most carried their secrets like open wounds, speaking only in fragments and never fully able to describe the horrors of what they had seen. Their words were scattered across the years, tucked into interviews, journals, or confessions made on deathbeds, yet together they revealed glimpses of a darkness that was carefully hidden for generations. Those who managed to escape told of a place that was far removed from the holy image painted for the public, a place where night was filled with terrors and the walls themselves seemed alive with menace. One girl who fled as a teenager later spoke of how silence was forced upon them inside the orphanage. The nuns demanded obedience without question, and the punishments for disobedience were brutal. She recalled being locked for hours in a narrow closet, her cries muffled by the sound of hymns sung by the rest of the children. Another remembered the sensation of being watched constantly, even in sleep, and how the slightest mistake was met with sudden violence. Their days were filled with strict routines of prayer and labor, but it was the nights that left the deepest scars. The survivors described how the air grew heavy after sunset, how footsteps echoed through the halls even when no one was there, and how certain girls were summoned in the dead of night, never to return to their beds. Those who escaped spoke of locked doors that led to places children were never supposed to see. One survivor described being taken to a hidden room lit by candlelight, where the walls were marked with strange symbols she could not understand. She claimed that there were other figures present, their faces obscured by hoods, chanting words that chilled her blood. The ritual ended before anything could be done to her, as a sudden noise distracted the gathering, allowing her to flee back through the corridors and hide among the laundry. Another recalled being restrained on a table while cold instruments pressed against her skin, the sound of nuns reciting prayers mingling with the metallic scraping of tools. These accounts differed in detail, yet each carried the weight of terror and a sense of something profoundly unnatural. The survivors also remembered the cries of the other children, cries that still echoed in their minds years later. They spoke of hearing sobs drifting through the walls at night, of muffled screams that no amount of hymns could cover, of the way the sound of weeping became as constant as the tolling of the chapel bell. Some said the voices came not just from their fellow orphans but from deeper places, as if the orphanage itself was filled with trapped souls crying out from hidden chambers below. For the girls who remained, every night was a gamble, a question of whether their name would be called, whether they would be the next to vanish. That fear carved itself into them, and even decades later, those who survived confessed they could still hear the echoes when they closed their eyes. In later years, paranormal investigators who entered the abandoned orphanage claimed that the survivors' stories were echoed in the very structure of the building. They recorded unexplained voices, the sound of children sobbing in empty rooms, and footsteps pacing across the floors of deserted halls. Some investigators claimed they felt cold hands brushing against their skin, while others described an overwhelming sense of dread, as though they were being watched from the shadows. These findings gave new weight to the survivors' accounts, suggesting that the trauma left behind had seeped into the orphanage itself, staining it in ways that time could not erase. The testimonies of those who lived through it also revealed the psychological toll the place took on its children. Survivors spoke of nightmares that plagued them into adulthood, dreams where they were back in the dormitories, waiting for the footsteps to stop outside their doors. They described an inability to trust authority, a fear of churches, and a deep sense of guilt for surviving when so many others had vanished. Some refused to even speak of the orphanage at all, carrying their trauma silently, while others tried to piece together their memories in order to make sense of what had happened. Yet all of them agreed that Sacred Heart was not a place of sanctuary, but a prison of shadows, a place that devoured innocence and left scars that could never fully heal. Fragments of their stories often aligned with the rumors that had haunted the town for years. They spoke of candlelit ceremonies, of locked cellars where the walls were slick with moisture, of priests whose smiles concealed cruelty, and of nuns whose devotion to God seemed replaced by devotion to something else entirely. The consistency across these accounts gave them credibility, even if no official records ever acknowledged the horrors. Each testimony became a piece of a puzzle, a glimpse into a nightmare that the church had buried beneath its robes of sanctity. The voices of the survivors also gave life to the silence of the missing. 71 girls left no words behind, no stories to tell, but those who escaped spoke on their behalf, carrying their memory through whispered accounts and haunted recollections. Their testimonies became living proof that the disappearances were not mere accidents or runaways, but part of something deliberate, something orchestrated within the walls of the orphanage itself. In their words, the missing were not forgotten. They lingered in the sobs, the screams, and the flicker of candlelight that burned endlessly in the minds of those who endured and lived to remember. The legacy of Sacred Heart Orphanage did not end with its closure. When the doors were finally locked and the grounds abandoned, the building itself seemed to resist decay, standing as a monument to what had been hidden within. For years it sat in silence, its windows broken by storms, its walls stained by rain, yet the shape of the structure remained, looming over the town like an unspoken accusation. People avoided the grounds, children dared each other to run up to the gates, and those who lived nearby swore the sound of crying sometimes drifted from within, even though the halls had been empty for decades. The orphanage had become more than just a place. It had become a wound that the community could never close, a scar left open to remind everyone of what had been lost. As the years passed, stories clung to the ruins like ivy. Some claimed the spirits of the 71 girls were trapped inside, unable to rest because their lives had been stolen. Others whispered that the rituals carried out beneath the chapel had left a permanent mark, a curse that lingered in the stones themselves. Investigators who entered the orphanage spoke of hearing voices on recordings, of footsteps pacing across empty floors, of sudden cold spots that drained the breath from their lungs. One group claimed they saw shadowy figures darting along the corridors, moving just beyond the range of their lights, while another reported that their equipment failed whenever they approached the chapel, as if some unseen force was determined to keep its secrets. Local legends grew with each passing generation. Parents warned their children never to stray near the orphanage after dark, saying the spirits would call them by name and lure them inside. Some said if you stood at the gates at midnight, you would hear the tolling of the chapel bell even though its rope had long since rotted away. Others claimed the statue of the Virgin Mary in front of the building sometimes wept blood, her stone eyes filled with sorrow for the children who had vanished. These tales were passed along in hushed voices, half believed and half feared, until the orphanage became less a memory and more a living ghost story woven into the fabric of the town. Paranormal investigators, drawn by its reputation, ventured into the ruins time and again. Some emerged with little more than photographs of empty halls, but others returned pale and shaken, swearing that what they had experienced could not be explained. They spoke of hearing hymns sung by unseen voices, the sound of dozens of children whispering in unison from the walls. Some claimed to feel hands tugging at their clothes or hair, as though invisible children were reaching out for help. A few refused to ever go back, saying the sense of dread was too overwhelming, that the orphanage itself seemed alive, watching, waiting, feeding on the fear of those who entered. The legacy also lived on in the community's silence. For decades after its closure, official records remained sealed, and those connected to the church refused to speak of it. Families of the missing were left with no graves to visit, no closure to their grief. Their daughters were erased from history as if they had never existed, leaving only gaps in family trees and a haunting emptiness in their memories. Some descendants continued to search, digging through archives and forgotten ledgers, hoping to find even a trace of what happened, but most found nothing except altered records and broken promises. This silence deepened the sense that Sacred Heart was not just a tragedy but a deliberate erasure, a chapter of history torn out and hidden. Even as the town tried to move on, the orphanage lingered in subtle ways. Businesses failed when they tried to use the land, construction workers refused to demolish the building after too many accidents occurred, and developers claimed the ground itself seemed cursed. One story told of a man hired to tear down the chapel who fell from the scaffolding after claiming he heard a child's voice whisper his name. Another spoke of a fire that broke out in the archives where the orphanage's last remaining records were stored, destroying the documents before they could be reviewed. These incidents fueled the belief that whatever had happened inside Sacred Heart was not finished, that the past refused to be buried. To this day, the orphanage is remembered not for its intended purpose of charity, but for the fear it left behind. It became a symbol of how innocence can be betrayed under the guise of holiness, how trust in institutions can blind communities to the horrors unfolding before them. The cries of the lost children seem to echo not only in the walls, but in the memories of those who still speak of them, a constant reminder that 71 young lives vanished without explanation. Its legacy is written in the silence of missing records, in the grief of families denied the truth, and in the unease that creeps through the town whenever the shadow of the orphanage crosses their path. The building remains a destination for those seeking answers, but also for those drawn by the thrill of fear. Tourists visit its gates, daring each other to step closer, and ghost hunters record their findings to share with wide-eyed audiences. Yet beneath the thrill lies the reality of what it represents, a history of suffering that can never be undone. The orphanage may be empty now, but its legacy continues to breathe through every story told, every candle lit for the missing, and every shiver that runs down the spine of those who feel they are not alone when they stand before its ruins.